I thought maybe we could begin with that deal with Congress. Is it just a case of kicking the can down the road to September 30th? And do you think you got enough stuff out of it?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you at Milken today. No, I think first of all, it's important to keep the government open, and I think there's many aspects of the deal that are very important, including a significant increase in military spending, which was very important to the president, and significant money for border security.
You don't think you gave away too much in terms of, there's even things for Planned Parenthood there. A lot of the cuts people have talked about aren't there, and as you know, the wall is not being built. That wasn't a retreat.
Again, I think it was important to have an interim budget that kept the government open, and then we'll focus on what we want the real budget to be for next year.
Let's talk about your tax plan. We've got it in front of us. A lot in it depends on growth, and I was fascinated to hear you just say that you think that if you raise the growth in America from 2 to 3%, that's worth around $2 trillion over 10 years.
It is. It's a staggering amount of money.
What do you see as the biggest risk to that? To that number not happening, to you not being able to get it up to 3%?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that we need to do to create economic growth. The tax plan is one of them, sweeping reform in the tax plan, middle income tax cut, making businesses more competitive. We also need regulatory relief. Too many businesses are held back from making investments because of excess regulation, and we also need fair trade.
Can we just go through some of those? Firstly, on the deductions, you've done a lot about getting rid of most of the deductions. One you've hung on to is mortgage interest tax relief. You look around the world, many people have got rid of that. It plainly distorts a lot of markets, pushes money towards property. Why didn't you choose to target that?
I think the two things we've talked about keeping are charitable deductions, which we think is very important for social causes, and the other is the mortgage interest deduction. And it's a big part of the American dream to own a home.
So it's for political reasons rather than economic ones, per se?
No, it's not necessarily political. Home ownership is important. It's a big part of the economy. Housing finance is a very important part of creating economic growth.
Can we talk a bit about that element about regulations and getting rid of them? Which ones do you particularly want to target? You talked today about Dodd-Frank in some ways being too narrow on finance. You wanted to look much larger. How would you describe that? What is the broader aim, particularly with finance?
Well, in financial services, we're looking at everything. So we're not just looking at Dodd-Frank. We're looking at every single thing that's impacting. And we've had hundreds of people come in. We've reached out to big banks, small banks, finance companies, all different types of areas of the economy that impact credit. And we are determined to make sure we have proper regulation so that we don't put taxpayers at risk, but we also don't have overlapping regulation, and we have clarity, so banks and insurance companies know what they can do.
Would you think about a much more sweeping law that dealt with all this? I mean, is it a case of adapting Dodd-Frank, or perhaps starting again in some ways?
Well, when we come out with the report, and the first part of it will be in June, there will be certain recommendations that we're making that can be done at the regulatory agencies. There are certain things that can be done by executive order, and there are certain things that will require legislation. But there's a lot we can do without just looking at rewriting legislation, and that's one of the things we're very focused on.
Can I ask you a little bit about China? You talked a bit about you're going to deal with infrastructure, you're going to try and spend a huge amount of money. China's one of those places which wants to invest in America, but how comfortable are you with the idea of China being able to invest in things like, nuclear plants and things like that? Where do you stand on that?
Well, let me first say we had a very productive meeting with the Chinese at Mar-a-Lago. We agreed to move forward on what we're calling the comprehensive economic dialogue. We've agreed, and we're working on a 100-day plan where we can begin to have meaningful impact on things that make sense to work together. The United States is the most open place to invest. The only thing is that we have a process under CFIUS, which I chair, that for national security reasons, we can block investments. And that'll be something that we will continue to do to make sure we protect our national security interests.
You seem to hint earlier that national security might not be enough. At the moment, CFIUS can only come in over the issue of national security, as you said. Would you like to see that a bit broader? I was in China the other day and people were talking about maybe buying Paramount. it's hard to claim that's an issue of national security, but isn't that something broader that maybe America, some of the people who supported you, would like to hang on?
I think CFIUS does a lot, and there's a lot of tools we have. There are certain things where it could be expanded slightly, and Congress is working on certain changes, but I think it gives us a lot of protections. And again, this isn't about targeting any one country from not investing here. This is about national security interests. So if there are things that are national security, that's what we're focused on.
But you're prepared to go a little bit broader for things of cultural significance or things that you think would really matter to America?
This is not about cultural issues. This is about national security.
Again, on infrastructure, we talked about that. You know, you've got these huge plans, this enormous idea that you're going to spend $1 trillion. You've talked about being creative on the financing on it. Private partnerships, you've talked about that. The other big issue is whether maybe you might have some very long bonds, whether America would begin to issue maybe 40, 50 very, very long bonds to support long-term investment. Is that one of the areas you might look at?
We are studying ultra-long bonds. Yeah. That's something we're considering at Treasury. We have a working group looking at it. We think that it's something that could absolutely make sense for us at Treasury. But on the infrastructure side, you know, the president's determined that we make a major investment. There's a huge part of the infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt, and we're going to do that in a lot of different ways through public-private partnerships and different financing so we don't balloon the budget by $1 trillion.
But do you think there's fundamentally, in many ways, governments look at infrastructure and things in the wrong way? At the moment, everything gets chucked into general accounts. If you were running a company, which you've done several times, if you're putting long-term investment, that would be counted differently than short-term cash flow. Is that one of the restrictions you face?
Absolutely. I mean, as you know, when you're running a business, you have an income statement and a balance sheet. And if you're making an investment that has a 20 or 30-year payback, you don't expense it all in day one or look at it as a complete expense. The government budget treats everything as cash, so it makes it more difficult.
You probably have more investors watching this network than anything around the world. If you had to bring them in to finance that infrastructure, what's the main ploy you would make? Is it merely to do with pricing, to do with long-term? What is the bit of...
I think we've seen lots of interest from our counterparts in investing in the United States, whether it's in infrastructure or whether it's other opportunities. So I think this is something that we're going to be able to get done.
And that long-term plan to boost growth, does that in the end come back to the same sort of medicine, I suppose, that Ronald Reagan did? This idea that you cut taxes and you get rid of regulation, that will push growth by itself?
I think that's a big part of it. That's not the only issue. As I said, we need regulatory relief and we need trade reform. But simplifying taxes and making businesses competitive are a big part of it. We have trillions of dollars that U.S. companies have left offshore that we expect that will come back and will be reinvested in this country.
You've talked a couple of times about trade. It strikes me that is the one area where you are perhaps more in conflict with the many business people at this Congress than you are on other issues. Most people like the idea of cutting taxes. Most people like the idea of regulation being sorted out. But the idea of being turning against free trade, do you think that is a problem for the administration?
I think quite frankly it's the opposite. We believe in free and fair trade, and where we're attacking things is where it's not free and fair. And as I've said, if we're charging someone zero tariffs and they're charging us 20 or 25%, that's not free trade.
You've studied economics. You know that the benefits from having low tariffs go to the people who import as much as the people who export.
That's true, but free and fair trade is a reciprocal agreement. Like anything else, any deals that companies do or countries should do, it's about deals that should be fair in both directions. So we want to make sure that U.S. companies have every opportunity to export, and we're focused on growing exports, not cutting imports. But our trade imbalance is too big. It hurts the American worker, and that's something that the president is very focused on.
And one last thing on that, the whole issue of calling China a currency manipulator, do you think walking back from that has made sense and has made your job easier?
I think we had a very important meeting with the Chinese. I think the president has made it very clear that the number one priority is to have them help with North Korea, and that's something that they're doing.
And the security side of your job has become a bigger factor than you expected when you went to Washington.
It is. I'm spending a lot of time on the sanctions programs and terrorist financing, and it's a very important part of everything we do.